Hi there, this is Brent, and in this video we're going to go through the Create Dynamic Content, and that's under the Swift UI section under Lists and Text Fields, and it's this Create Dynamic Content tutorial. Let's go ahead and open Xcode. Let's create a new project. We've got iOS selected and it's an app, and then we choose Next. For the name, we're going to say pick a pal, and we'll go with the default settings, choose Next, pick a place you want to save it, and go ahead and click Create. Once that loads, first thing we want to do, if you double click up here in the header, it'll fill the screen. So that's what I like to do so I can see everything. And the first thing we're going to do is in our V stack, we want to remove these items. So select and press backspace. And then we want to create a list. And the simplest way to create a list is just to type list and then opening brace, press return. And then let's add some text fields. So we're going to say text, and let's pick some names. So we have Elisha, text. Let's do another one, Andre. Let's do another text, Jasmine, and one more, Pochan. So when you create it like this, it automatically creates the list, and if you interact with it, you can click and you can see how it behaves. So it looks and feels like the list view that we're familiar with in most of our applications. Notice there's the text, there's a little divider line, and it's got rounded corners and everything. And so this is kind of the basics or the simplest way to create a list. Now, rather than having these statically typed or hard-coded, as we like to call it, we want to dynamically load this. So let's go ahead and delete these texts. And then let's create a state variable. So you remember, use the @ sign and then state. And remember, state variables are always private. And then it's a var. And we'll call it names. And this is going to be of type, it's going to be array of strings. And so let's go ahead and create, and we'll use the same names that we had before. So I'm just typing Andre, Jasmine, Pochan. All right. So we've got our array. Now, in order to see them on the screen, we want to use the for each view. You remember in the previous tutorials, a for each view will go through an array and then output whatever you have in the code block. And so for our cases, we're going to create a for each, and then open parenthesis, and we're going to say names, which is the data source. And then the ID is just going to be the \.description. And then we have an opening brace, and then we say name in. And now we can have it for every name in the names array. We're going to have it create a text and using the name. So now we have the same list that we had before, but instead of hard coding every single one, we now have it dynamically created with an array of names, and then it updates that. So every time this names array changes, it will update the view by either adding or removing a name. In order for us to add a name to our list, we need a text field. And before we do that, we want to add another state variable so that we can keep track of the name that we're adding. And so come up here, we're going to say at state private var. We're going to call this name to add and set it equal to an empty string. Now, notice that we didn't put the type. We didn't indicate what variable type this was because, again, you have this type inference because we've assigned a string, empty string to it, that we know then that this var is a string. And that's called type inference. Let's go ahead and add a text field underneath our list. So within the list, then we're going to say text field. And we're going to do open parentheses. And then the first property is a string, which is the text that shows up in the text field. And so it's add name and then a comma and then text. We're going to do what's called a binding. And the binding is, you use the $sign and then name to add. So now what we've done is whatever text gets entered into this text field then automatically updates this state variable, which is name to add. And so we use the $sign to indicate that this variable is now bound to the property. And so whenever this value changes, when the text field text is written, it updates this state value, this state variable called name to add. Once we've entered text, then we want to process the text, the name, and we use a property, a modifier on the text field called onSubmit. And what that does is it adds this closure, and we can, every time we press return on the keyboard, we've entered text, it will run the code that's in this block. In our case, we want to add the name to our names array. So we use a method called append, and then we pass in name to add, which is the variable that's created or updated. And so it's the state variable that gets updated. And then what we do is once we have set that, then we reset the name to add to an empty string. So we set it to equals to an empty string. So let's take a look at that and see how that works. So if I come down here, and here in the preview, because I have my keyboard, I'm on the computer, I can just type, and so I can just say Brent, and then when I press return, it adds it to the array, and then it clears what was typed. So that's all done in this code. Every time you press return on the text field, it calls this onSubmit method or onSubmit event, and then this code is executed. Notice if I don't type anything and I just press return, it'll add an empty value to our list. Well, if you want to avoid doing that, then what we'll do is we need to add an if statement, and we only call the code if the name to add text has, if it's not an empty string. Let's come up here and wrap these in an if block. And so I'll say if, and then we use an exclamation point, name to add dot is empty. Then it'll execute this block, and so we'll add it, and now it's fixed these errors. Okay, this exclamation point is shorthand for not. When we say if this is not true, then we execute the code. Is empty returns true or false. So if it is empty, it returns true. If it is not empty, it will return false. So we're checking if this is false, if it evaluates to false, which means there is text. And so now when I come over here and I start typing, I can say John, and I can then click here again and I can press enter, and it doesn't do anything because it's an empty string. It only adds it if this names to add is not empty because of that exclamation point at the beginning. If we want to see how this looks with the keyboard on the device, you can go ahead and run this in the simulator. And when that loads, it'll take a second the first time you run it. Now when we go ahead and click into the text, it shows the keyboard. And then from here, we can say Frank and then press return. Or if I just press return, everything works as expected. Let's close this and come back to the project. One thing we need to do is in a text field, now you have down here, you see this debugger window, and the debugger window shows up anytime you run in the simulator. If you don't want to see that, you can go ahead and click the little corner button here to hide that. Give yourself a little more room. One thing we notice if you're working with a text field, also, when you're using the simulator, then the preview will stop. And so if you want to show the preview again, then you click the refresh button, and now we're back to the preview. One thing that happens when you're working with names, we don't want to use autocomplete. So you can disable autocomplete by using a modifier on the text field called .autocorrect disabled. Autocorrection disabled. And so now when you type, it's not going to suggest, oh, this word isn't a real word, and try to complete things for you when you're using proper nouns. Next, we want to add a text that shows a random name, where we can pick a random name. And so we'll add a button, and then we have some text up here that shows picking a random name from this list. So the first thing we want to do is create a state variable, and we'll call it, so we'll say at state private var, we'll call it picked name, and we'll set it equal to an empty string. And then in our VStack, above the list, we want to add a text, and we'll call it picked name dot is empty, and then a question mark, and then we're going to have a space, and then colon picked name. Now we don't have anything showing yet, but there's a few things mentioned in the tutorial I want to talk about. So what we've done is we've done shorthand for an if-else statement. The way this works, this is called a ternary operation, and it's a shorthand for saying if this information returns true, then use this value. Else, if this returns false, then you use this value. Now, remember, when you use the method isEmpty, it's going to return true if it's empty, and it's going to return false if it's not empty. So this evaluates to true. That means we're going to have an empty string, and so we're going to set this to an empty string, and the tutorial mentions you actually want to use a space, because if the text view is empty, then it'll hide it, but if there's an actual space in it, then it will show it. It's hard to tell, but there is an extra space up here, and so it just suggests keeping it as a space in order for the text view to be rendered on the screen all the time. Again, if this is not empty, that means we've picked a name, then it's going to show the picked name. Again, the tutorial refers to this shortcut, this whole line here where we have uh, a something that's evaluated to true or false, and then we have the question mark, we have the first value, then we have a colon, and then we have the second value. This is called a ternary conditional operator, and it's a shortcut for saying if else. So if it's this, do that, else we do that. And so you'll see this a lot, and it's just a shorthand, so you don't have to have 3 or 4 lines of code. You just have this one line. Next thing we want to do is add a button, and we're going to put it below the text field. So let's come down here, and below our text field, we're going to say button. And for the text, we're going to say pick random name. And then we have the closure. Inside the closure, we're going to we're going to write the following code. So we're going to say if let random name equals names dot random element. Then we have another brace block. We're going to say picked name equals random name. And then after this curly brace, we're going to say else picked name equals, it's empty. Okay, there's a lot going on here. What we're doing is we're calling a method on the array of names, and it's called random element. There's a potential that the random element that it pulls could be empty or nil. And if that's the case, it could crash. If this returned a value and we went to assign it, or we went to access something that didn't exist. So we use this conditional, which is called if let, and it's a safety. It's a way of only assigning this value if this value exists. And so you'll see that in other future videos. We'll talk about optional parameters, optional variables, and you use if let to safely assign something or get something, so that if this ever returned nil, as in it didn't exist, then it won't crash on you. So it's saying if this exists, give me a random element from this array, so a random name, and assign it to picked name. Else, if it doesn't, if there is no names there, then we'll just set picked name to an empty string. Let's see how this looks. So if I click the button, pick random name, then remember we've got a state variable that updates the UI, and the text is we're saying picked name. And so here it's changed it. So now we can pick a different random name and it will update it. Let's finish off the UI here by adding a divider. So just above this button, we're going to add a divider, and you'll see the little divider here. We want to now add another UI element called a toggle, and the toggle will allow the user to, if we pick a name, we want to remove it from the list. And so to keep track of whether we should remove a name from the list or not, well, let's create another state variable, and we'll call this private var. We'll call it should remove picked name, and we'll set it to false. So here we have a Boolean, which means it's either true or false. And again, because of type inference, we don't have to set the type. Now you could say like this, and then that's perfectly valid, and you've assigned this variable is a type of Boolean and it's equal to false. But when you're using a default value, you set a default value, then the type is inferred from what this value is, and the type false is a Boolean. So that's how that works. All right, let's go down here and under our divider, let's add a toggle. And a toggle is just toggle. And then the first parameter is text. So we're going to say remove when picked. And then we add a comma, and then we say is on, and we tab and we get autocomplete. And now we bind to a property. And remember, when you are binding to a variable, you're using the $sign, and we say should remove picked name. So now when this toggle, the value of this toggle is on, is based on whether this is true or false. So when I come over here, now we've set it to true, now we've set it to false. Next, we're going to update the code inside the pick random name so that when we click this button, if this is set to true, then we remove it from the list. Otherwise, we don't remove it from the list. And so down here in our if statement, just after the picked name, we're going to check the value of should remove picked name. So we're going to say if should remove picked name, then it's going to call the following code, and it's going to say names dot remove all, and then we're going to say name in, and we're going to say return, and we're going to run in parentheses name equals random name. Now, let's talk about this. There's a lot going on here. Here we have another method on the array that's called remove all. And what it's going to do is we're passing in a reference to each item in the list, and we're only going to remove the name if it is equal to the random name that we have selected. So what that's saying is for every one of these items in the array, it's going to check if the current item in the array equals the random name that was selected. If it does, then it's going to remove it. So to see that in action, if I click pick random name, notice that every time it shows up here, it stays the same. But if I toggle this to remove when picked, now when I pick a name, it actually removes it. And if I do that again, it's going to continue to remove it. And I do that again. And hey, now I've removed all my names. If I add a name, I can say Brent. I can say Frank. And now I can pick a name and remove it. If I turn that off, then it'll pick a random name. Of course, there's only one element, but you get the idea. So now we have a toggle that relates to what we do when we click the pick random name button. Let's change the style of this button, and we're going to make a couple of changes to this button here. So at the end of the button, we want to use a property called button style, and we're going to pass in dot bordered prominent. And if you use the arrow keys, you can navigate to it and then you press return. So now we have a prominent bordered button. And then let's add a font. And for the font, we're going to say dot title. And now we have a larger button. We want to change the look of this button by using an additional closure. And so what we can do is we can select the parentheses and we can delete that. And then down here on the bottom, we can add another closure which is called label. And now we can pass in information. We'll pass in a text, and we just say pick random name. Now, visually it looks the same. It's the same behavior as if it was up here, but now we have two closures. We have one closure for the action, and then the second closure for the actual label or the visual element of the button. What this does is it actually allows you to add whatever visual elements you want into creating this as a button, and so it allows you to extend it quite a bit. For our purposes in this tutorial, we just want to add some padding. And remember, when you add, when a modifier has multiple parameters, you can add them individually. So we could say dot vertical padding, and then set that comma, and then set that to 8. And so then we can also add horizontal padding. So we can say padding and add dot horizontal, and then set that to 16. And so now what we've done is we've added padding to both the top and the sides using multiple modifiers, adding specific values for each one that we want to change. Let's add some more style to our application. First, let's add an icon and a title. So if we come up here to the top, and we're at the top of our V stack, then go ahead and give yourself a few spaces, and let's add another V stack. And in this case, we're going to set the spacing to 8. And then we're going to add an image, and it'll be system name. And in this case, we're going to say person.3.sequence.fill. And then we'll have a text view, and we'll call it pick a pal. So now we have an icon, we have an image at the top, and then we have a text title. Let's change the styling on this, and we'll set the font weight to, the font style to dot title, and then set it to bold. And notice that it affects both of these, the image and the text, because we're adding the modifier to the V stack that contains everything in there. So you notice they both changed. Next, let's change the color of the image. Let's add a modifier, the foreground style, and we'll pass in the application tint. And again, we remember we talked about the application in the assets folder has accent color, and that's referred to as the tint. And so now we have that set up there. One of the other things you can do with the SF symbols is there's what they call a hierarchy of rendering. And what it means is that there's ways that you can affect the various levels of the images and the various things. We saw a little bit of that in the dice roll tutorial. But in this case, what we want to do is set what's called the symbol rendering mode. And we're going to set it to dot hierarchical. And notice what happens is it now has this, changes the opacity, so it has a darker and then lighter and even more lighter on that. And you can kind of experiment with this to see the different rendering modes and how they affect these symbols. Let's add some styles to the picked name text. So let's set the font to dot title, set it to bold as well, and set the foreground style to tint. And go ahead and pick a random name so you can see what that looks like. So now you can see the changes that we just made. One thing we can do to the list, notice that we have this list embedded within the screen. We have elements above it and elements below it. We can actually add a clipping corner to add rounded corners. Notice this gray is kind of squared off. We can actually change that by adding what's called a clip shape, and we pass in rounded rectangle, and we set a corner radius of 8. And notice it's a little subtle, but notice it changed to rounded corners. Finally, let's customize the accent color for this application. So remember, if you go back to the assets catalog, and it's the accent color, and from here we can select that and then show the inspector on the right. And from here we want to change the color, and if you remember, you set it to display P3, and now we can set a custom value. So if I double click on that, and from the tutorial it says for red we say 0.345, and then I press tab. Green is 0.337, tab, and then 0.812, and now we have that color. So now if we go back to our content view, and if we refresh this, it's going to update, and notice that we've got that purple color for the accent color, which shows up on the image and on the button. Looking at the tutorial, I realized on the button it actually says, for the font, it says use title 2. And notice how that changes it. So notice it modified the size and everything. Remember, you can experiment with these. There's a whole bunch of options available, and you can see how it affects the button as well as the image and the text. There's a lot that it can do. Okay, that is everything for this application, for this tutorial. Let's go ahead and check our understanding and see how we did. If we scroll down here, then, whoops, sorry, moving fast. Select the correct code for passing view state into a control. So what that means is we have a binding. See what it did there? I see what it did there. See which one is right. Okay, notice it uses state, and then, okay, check this out. It's going to be this one. And the reason is that because you have to use a state variable, it's not binding. That's a different property. That's a different, that is a valid one, but it's not used for state variables. You use state, and then you use the $sign on when you say this is now uses the binding. Here, it's got a $sign on the variable on both places, and that's not correct. So here we'll go ahead and click submit. It says yes, use state to represent the state of a view, then create a binding using the $sign. All right, next question. Select the ternary conditional operator that never results in a number greater than 100. Okay, this is a trick question here. So let's speak through each one of these. So it says if the value is greater than 100, then it is 100, or it is the value. Oh, this is wrong because it doesn't have the question mark. Here, let's read this one. So this is wrong because it doesn't have the question mark. Value is greater than 100, then it's the value, else it's 100. And then in this case, it's the same. So this is written, these two are written correctly. If value is greater than 100, then it's 100, else it's the value. Select the ternary conditional operator that never results in a number greater than 100. Okay, I think it's this one. Code submit. Yep, if the value is greater than 100, the result is 100, the value after the question mark. Otherwise, the result is the original value, which is less than 100. Select the code that performs an action when people tap return in a text field. So you remember, it's the onSubmit modifier. Use the onSubmit modifier to react to text entry in a text field. Sweet, you did it. Well, thank you for watching. Be sure to check out the other tutorials, and please like, subscribe, and be on the lookout for the next video. Talk to you later.